Welcome back to Cyberspace. I'm your host, Leslie Poston. Today, we're going to talk about something that surrounds us every waking moment of our lives. An invisible force so pervasive that it shapes our behaviors, our beliefs, and even our identities without us fully realizing it. If you caught our episode on propaganda and authoritarian regimes, think of this as a companion piece exploring how similar psychological principles operate in commercial contexts. What if I told you that from the moment you wake up until you fall asleep, you're swimming in an ocean of influence? That your phone, your social media feeds, the billboards you pass on your commute, the headlines in your favorite paper or magazine, the packaging of your breakfast cereal, and even the layout of your local grocery store are all part of an intricate system designed to guide your thoughts and actions. This isn't a conspiracy, it's marketing. And when we zoom out to see its full scope and impact, we see how marketing and propaganda exist on the same spectrum of persuasion. Everyone likes to think they're immune to propaganda and marketing, but that's not how our brains work. Everyone is susceptible to some degree. This episode is about empowerment through awareness. By understanding the psychological mechanisms that make marketing work, we can make more conscious choices about what we consume, both literally and figuratively. We'll explore how the lines between selling products and selling ideas have blurred, and how this affects everything from our personal purchasing habits to our national politics. So settle in and let's navigate what McGuire called the persuasion matrix together. Let's get clear on what we're talking about. Marketing, at its heart, is about influencing behavior, typically getting people to choose a specific product, service, or brand. It's the art and science of understanding what people want and need, and then communicating how your offering satisfies those desires. When done well, marketing creates value for both the seller and the buyer. Propaganda operates with similar mechanisms but different goals. While marketing typically aims to sell products or services, propaganda seeks to promote particular ideas, causes, or political agendas. Originally, the word propaganda simply meant propagating ideas, but the 20th century changed that perception dramatically. During both world wars, governments weaponized mass communication to mobilize their populations and demonize enemies. Think of Uncle Sam pointing at you declaring, "I want you" for the U.S. Army, or the grotesque caricatures of Japanese people in American wartime posters. These weren't subtle. They were designed to evoke strong emotional responses, patriotism, fear, and anger, that would override our rational thought. The Nazi regime's minister of propaganda, Joseph Goebbels, perfected these techniques to horrifying effect, creating a blueprint for how mass persuasion could reshape an entire society's values and behaviors. After witnessing these historical abuses, the word propaganda became permanently tainted. Today, the boundaries between marketing and propaganda have become increasingly blurred. Both use similar psychological principles to influence behavior. Both tap into our emotions, our desire to belong, our fears and aspirations, but the primary differences lie in transparency of intent and the nature of the product being sold. Marketing that obscures its persuasive intent begins to resemble propaganda. Think about it. When a soft drink company associates its brand with freedom or friendship or happiness, is it still just selling sugary water, or is it selling ideology? When a political campaign uses sophisticated targeting to deliver personalized messages based on your psychological profile, is that marketing or propaganda? These questions are worth asking, since we're exposed to thousands of persuasive messages every day. What about the psychological engines that power effective marketing and propaganda? These aren't secret mind control techniques. They're well-documented patterns in human behavior that marketers have learned to leverage. Understanding them is your first line of defense against unwanted influence. Social proof might be the most powerful of these principles. We're fundamentally social creatures, and we look to others for guidance on how to behave. When we see that a product has thousands of 5-star reviews, or that a video has millions of views, or everyone, quote, is talking about a particular TV show, we're much more likely to check it out ourselves. That isn't weak-mindedness. It's an evolutionary shortcut for decision making. In our ancestral environment, following the group was often the safest bet. Marketing taps into this instinct constantly. Those customer testimonials, that's social proof. Influencer marketing, that's social proof on steroids. Those trending sections on streaming platforms, you guessed it, social proof. Sometimes artificially manufactured to create the bandwagon effect. Scarcity and exclusivity trigger another powerful psychological response. We value things more when they seem rare or hard to obtain. That's why limited time offers are so effective and why exclusive access feels special, or why artificial scarcity like Disney's famous vault strategy for movies can drive consumer behavior. The fear of missing out is real and is rooted in our brain's tendency to give more weight to potential losses than to equivalent gains. This is called loss aversion, and it's a cornerstone of behavioral economics. Marketers trigger this response when they emphasize what you'll miss rather than what you'll gain. Don't miss out on this amazing offer is psychologically more powerful than take advantage of this amazing offer. Authority and credibility work as persuasion shortcuts too. We tend to trust experts and authority figures, which is why celebrity endorsements work, why we respond to people in lab coats or uniforms in advertisements, and why brands tout their expertise or their heritage. The Milgram experiments from the 60s demonstrated just how powerful authority can be. Participants were willing to deliver what they thought were dangerous electric shocks to others simply because an authority figure in a lab coat instructed them to do so. While marketing rarely asks us to go to such extremes, it regularly leverages the tendency of some brains to defer to perceived authorities and experts. This principle becomes concerning when propaganda leverages manufactured or misleading authority. Think of health misinformation spread by people with fake credentials, or political messaging falsely claims scientific consensus. So we know the transition from standard marketing to something more like propaganda happens when persuasion shifts towards manipulation. But what's the difference? Persuasion respects the audience's agency and critical thinking. It presents information and appeals that can be evaluated and potentially rejected. Manipulation, on the other hand, bypasses critical thinking and exploits psychological vulnerabilities to achieve compliance without true consent. We see this transition happen across multiple domains. In business, when corporations fund grassroots movements to support their interests. In religion, when emotional appeals override rational examination of belief. And in politics, when complex policy issues are reduced to simplistic, fear-based messaging. This shift often involves emotional hijacking, triggering strong emotional responses that override rational thought. Fear is particularly effective. When we're afraid, the amygdala, our brain's alarm system, activates, and resources shift away from the prefrontal cortex where our higher level thinking occurs. We become more reactive and less reflective. You've seen this in action with health product marketing that first magnifies anxiety about aging or illness before presenting their solution, or with political messaging that exaggerates threats to safety or to identity. These approaches don't just try to convince you, they aim to bypass your critical faculties entirely. Identity and tribalism represent another pathway from marketing to propaganda. Humans have a fundamental need to belong to groups, and we readily adopt in-group favoritism and out-group bias. Marketing that positions a brand as part of your identity, like Apple's famous "I'm a Mac, I'm a PC" campaign, is tapping into this tribal instinct. But propaganda takes this further by creating sharp us versus them division and associating the, quote, other with threat, disgust, or contempt. Once an issue becomes tied to group identity, facts become surprisingly irrelevant to our position. Studies show that people with high scientific literacy and quantitative reasoning skills are actually more polarized on issues like climate change than those with lower skills, because they're better at finding evidence that supports their group's position. This effect, called motivated reasoning, explains why simply providing facts rarely changes minds on ideologically charged issues. The most sophisticated forms of influence don't tell people what to think. They establish the framework within which thinking happens. This is the concept of framing, and it's powerful because we don't notice it happening. Consider how the phrase tax relief frames taxes as an affliction requiring a remedy, rather than one pillar of societal support. Or how calling estate taxes death taxes frames them as punishing mortality rather than extreme wealth. By controlling the metaphors and frames through which issues are discussed, marketers and propagandists can predetermine the conclusions people reach while maintaining the illusion of free choice. Another example was from COVID policy debates in the mid-2020s, focusing on whether we should, quote, open up the economy versus, quote, protect public health. That framing suggested those goals were in opposition, and it shaped all subsequent discussion. The media landscape has transformed dramatically, creating new possibilities for both marketing and propaganda that earlier generations couldn't have imagined. Today's environment isn't just about more ads in more places, it's a fundamental shift in how information flows and how influence operates. Traditional advertising operated in a world of scarcity, limited TV channels, radio stations, and print publications. In that environment, broad messaging aimed at mass audiences was the norm. Today, we have an abundance of content, but a scarcity of attention. This has led to increasingly targeted marketing based on ever more granular data about our preferences, behaviors, and psychological profiles. The social media platforms we use aren't products we consume. They're sophisticated behavior modification systems that simultaneously study and influence us. Every like, share, comment, and click feeds algorithms that get better at predicting and shaping what we'll do next. This isn't speculation. It's their business model, explicitly acknowledged in patents, investor presentations, and internal documents. This targeting capability creates filter bubbles where we primarily encounter content that confirms our existing beliefs. These bubbles aren't just comfortable, they can be addictive. Our brains release dopamine when our views are confirmed, creating a reward cycle that keeps us coming back. The technologies enabling this have evolved rapidly. Predictive algorithms that anticipate what will capture our attention, A/B testing that refines messaging for maximal emotional impact, psychographic targeting that segments audiences by personality traits rather than simple demographics, and real-time bidding systems that determine what messages appear in your feed within milliseconds. Over time, this has led to belief polarization, where different groups hold increasingly extreme and incompatible views of reality itself. What makes this dangerous is that we typically don't realize it's happening. Most people believe they see a representative sample of information, unaware of how thoroughly their media diet is personalized, and they're usually just on social media to get some news or to connect with their friends or colleagues. This creates fertile ground for propaganda, as messages can be tailored to specific psychological profiles and delivered in environments free from competing perspectives or fact-checking. Media literacy hasn't kept pace with these technological changes. Most of us weren't taught to question who created a piece of content, or why it appeared in our feed, what it might be leaving out, or how it might be manipulating our emotions. We haven't developed immunity to persuasion techniques that didn't exist when we were forming our critical thinking skills. Native advertising that blends seamlessly with editorial content, deep fakes that can put words in people's mouths, and fabricated social proof through fake accounts and engagement, these challenges require new forms of literacy. You can learn about those in our episode on the 4 types of literacy we need to survive the digital age. Perhaps most concerning is the asymmetry of power, though. Ordinary people using these platforms often have neither the transparency nor the tools to fully understand how they're being influenced, while those controlling the platforms and purchasing influence have unprecedented capabilities to shape behavior. Let's look at some real-world examples where marketing crossed into the realm of propaganda. These aren't just academic exercises, they show how the principles we've discussed operate in practice, help us sharpen our ability to recognize when we're being influenced. The tobacco industry provides one of the clearest examples of marketing as propaganda. For decades, cigarette companies like Philip Morris and R.J. Reynolds knew about the deadly effects of their products, waged sophisticated campaigns to create doubt about the science. This might sound familiar in our current landscape in the United States. They funded research designed to confuse rather than clarify, created front groups with scientific-sounding names, positioned their products as symbols of freedom and personal choice. One of their most effective tactics was to frame smoking regulations as a tax on individual liberty rather than as public health measures. Internal documents later revealed their explicit strategy was that doubt is our product, not to prove tobacco was safe, but to maintain the appearance of scientific controversy. This campaign delayed effective public health measures for decades, with deadly consequences measured in millions of lives, and we can see this campaign being repeated even now with vaccines, with autism, and with COVID precautions. Tech companies' use of the term sharing economy represents a more subtle example. Firms like Uber and Airbnb frame their business models as part of a progressive movement toward community resource sharing, obscuring the fact that they were actually introducing new forms of unregulated commerce. The language of sharing, hosts, and community evoked values of cooperation and sustainability, which helped those companies avoid the regulatory frameworks that governed traditional taxis and hotels. This wasn't just clever branding, it was a strategic narrative designed to reshape public perception and policy discussions. By positioning opponents as standing against progress and community values, these companies shifted the debate away from questions about worker protection, housing impacts, and fair competition. Health and wellness marketing often crosses into propaganda territory through a technique called problem construction, essentially manufacturing or exaggerating health concerns to sell solutions. Consider how the term halitosis was popularized by Listerine, and he wanted to transform occasional bad breath into a significant social disease requiring their product as a treatment. Or consider how the concept of body odor was largely created by deodorant companies to establish a new hygiene norm that required their products. More recently, pharmaceutical companies have been criticized for disease-mongering, expanding the boundaries of treatable conditions to include milder symptoms or normal variation, thereby creating larger markets for their drugs. When marketing not only promotes products, but actively reshapes our understanding of what constitutes a problem requiring intervention, it functions as propaganda by altering our perception of reality itself. Religious marketing has also employed sophisticated persuasion techniques that can cross into propaganda territory. Many megachurches and televangelists have adopted consumer marketing strategies, from sophisticated branding and production values to data-driven outreach campaigns. At their best, these approaches help connect people with communities that meet their spiritual needs. However, when these techniques are combined with appeals to fear, exclusion of outsiders, and unquestioning acceptance of authority, they begin to function as propaganda. Some prosperity gospel movements, for instance, employ classic marketing techniques like testimonials and social proof to promote their messages, while simultaneously discouraging critical examination of their claims by framing doubt as spiritual weakness. This creates powerful psychological barriers to questioning, exactly the same barriers that effective propaganda establishes. Understanding how our minds respond to marketing and propaganda isn't just academic, it's self-defense. Our attention is naturally drawn to certain stimuli, things that are novel, threatening, visually striking, or emotionally charged. This made perfect sense for our ancestors navigating physical dangers, but it creates vulnerabilities in an information environment. Clickbait headlines, alarming news chyrons, and emotionally provocative content exploit these attention triggers, often at the expense of more important but less immediately stimulating information. Studies show that outrage-inducing content spreads faster and farther on social media than any other emotion, for example, creating incentives for marketers and propagandists to trigger negative emotions. This attention hijacking doesn't just waste our time, it shapes our perception of the world, making threats and conflicts seem much more common than they actually are. We also rely heavily on mental shortcuts called heuristics to navigate complexity. These cognitive shortcuts are efficient but can lead us astray. The availability heuristic causes us to overestimate the likelihood of events that are easily recalled, which means vivid anecdotes and news stories often influence our risk assessment much more than accurate statistics. The anchoring effect shows how we're disproportionately influenced by the first number or piece of information we encounter, which explains why retailers show high original prices before discounts, or why negotiators start with extreme positions. Perhaps most relevant is the mere exposure effect. We tend to develop preferences for things simply because they're familiar. This explains why brand awareness campaigns work even without substantive messages, and why repeated exposure to misinformation makes it seem more credible over time, even if we initially recognize it as false. The most sophisticated influence techniques don't feel like influence at all. They create environments that naturally lead us towards certain choices while preserving our sense of autonomy. This is known as choice architecture, and it's everywhere. The layout of a store, the default settings on your devices, the order of items on a menu. These seemingly neutral design choices can dramatically affect behavior. We're seeing one egregious real-time abuse of this heuristic now with the way AI is being deployed. AI can be a positive for society, but it's everywhere and it's being made increasingly difficult to turn off, confusing people and narrowing choice. These techniques capitalize on well-documented psychological principles: the status quo bias that makes us prefer existing arrangements, the effort heuristic that leads us to value things more if they require some effort to obtain. We see this with IKEA furniture. And the illusion of control that maintains our sense of agency even when our choices are heavily constrained. The illusion of choice is particularly powerful. Presenting multiple options that all lead to a similar outcome creates the impression of freedom while still channeling behavior in predetermined directions. When marketers design these choice environments, they can nudge us towards options that benefit them rather than us, all while maintaining the illusion that we're making free choices. Similarly, propagandists don't need to tell people what to believe if they can control which questions are asked, which experts are considered credible, and which frames define the issues. This indirect influence is particularly effective because it doesn't trigger our psychological defenses against persuasion. We don't resist what we don't perceive. The ethics of persuasion aren't black and white. They exist on a spectrum that forces us to confront difficult questions about autonomy, transparency, and responsibility. Where exactly is the line between legitimate influence and manipulation, between education and indoctrination, between persuasion and propaganda? Transparency might seem like the obvious ethical requirement. People should know when they're being marketed to. But even this principle gets complicated in practice. Native advertising, influencer marketing, and product placement intentionally blur the lines between content and commerce. Political campaigns create seemingly grassroots movements that are actually carefully orchestrated. Even when disclosure is present, it's often designed to be overlooked or misunderstood. Research shows that many people don't recognize sponsored content even when it's labeled, and few understand the extent to which algorithms curate their online experience. Without meaningful transparency, informed consent becomes impossible. Power imbalances raise additional ethical concern. Modern persuasion techniques often leverage massive data advantages. Marketers may know more about your psychological vulnerabilities than you do yourself. They track your online behavior, purchase history, social connections, and sometimes even physiological responses to stimuli. They use A/B testing to refine messages for maximum impact and deploy machine learning algorithms that identify patterns humans wouldn't notice. When one side has vastly more information and resources than the other, can the resulting influence ever truly be fair? This asymmetry becomes especially problematic when targeting vulnerable populations like children, the elderly, or those experiencing psychological distress, groups who may have reduced capacity to recognize and resist persuasive techniques. Who bears responsibility for the societal effects of marketing and propaganda? Individual marketers might believe they're simply doing their jobs effectively, but collectively, their work can have profound and sometimes harmful impacts. The tobacco executives who denied the health risks of smoking, the pharmaceutical marketers who downplayed addiction risks of opioids, the political strategists who spread disinformation, all work within systems that reward effective persuasion regardless of the broader consequences. This diffusion of responsibility makes ethical accountability challenging. Professional organizations offer codes of ethics, but these are voluntary and often subordinated to client demands or profit motives. As society grapples with issues like rising polarization, declining trust in institutions, and the spread of misinformation, we need to confront the collective impact of an economy that rewards persuasion over truth. The cumulative effect of sophisticated marketing and propaganda extends far beyond individual purchase decisions or beliefs. It reshapes society itself. When persuasion becomes the dominant mode of public discourse, we all feel the consequences. Trust is perhaps the most significant casualty. As people become more aware of manipulation techniques, they often respond with blanket skepticism rather than nuanced discernment. The term fake news, originally meant to describe actual fabricated content, has become a universal dismissal of unwelcome information, regardless of its accuracy. When everything is marketing, nothing seems trustworthy. This erosion of trust creates a vacuum that's often filled by conspiracy theories, which offer the psychological comfort of explanatory narratives in a confusing world. The cruel irony is that those most proudly skeptical of mainstream information are often the most vulnerable to alternative sources that use the same psychological influence techniques while presenting themselves as truth tellers. Without shared facts as a foundation, democratic deliberation becomes nearly impossible. Our attention itself has become a commodity, extracted and sold through increasingly sophisticated means. The business model of many digital platforms depends on maximizing, quote, engagement, a euphemism for capturing and holding attention, regardless of the content's value or impact. This creates what some researchers are calling an attention economy, where our most precious cognitive resource is harvested and monetized. The consequences include declining attention spans, increased anxiety, and reduced capacity for deep thinking and reading. When combined with personalized content delivery that prioritizes emotional engagement over accuracy or importance, this system fragments our collective consciousness into millions of individual reality bubbles, each optimized for maximum engagement rather than for understanding or for truth. Perhaps most concerning is how pervasive marketing and propaganda techniques have changed political discourse and governance. Political campaigns increasingly resemble product marketing, focusing on emotional appeals, identity signaling, and opponent demonization rather than policy substance. The skills that get politicians elected, effective persuasion and message discipline, are often at odds with the skills needed for actual effective governance, which requires nuance, compromise, and accommodation of complex realities. When governance itself becomes performance rather than problem solving, society loses the capacity to address collective challenges that require shared understanding and coordinated action. Climate change, pandemic response, economic inequality. These issues can't be effectively addressed when our information environment prioritizes persuasion over truth and division over cohesion. Given all we've discussed, how can we protect ourselves and our communities from unwanted influence? The good news is that awareness itself provides significant immunity. Once you understand the mechanisms of persuasion, they become a little easier to spot and evaluate consciously rather than respond to automatically. Start by slowing down your information consumption and response. And I know that seems like a tall order in this moment in time, but it's worth trying. Many influence techniques rely on triggering quick emotional reactions that bypass critical thinking. When you feel a strong emotional response to content, especially anger or outrage, that's your cue to pause and examine what's happening. Ask yourself, what specific emotion am I feeling right now? What triggered it? Who benefits from me feeling this way? Is this emotion proportionate to the actual situation? Why is this message time to be seen or heard at this moment in time? Simply creating this space between the stimulus and the response can disrupt many persuasion techniques that depend on immediacy. And this doesn't mean emotions are irrelevant or always manipulative. They're essential signals, but they should inform our thinking rather than replace it. Practice active rather than passive media consumption. Instead of letting algorithms determine your information diet, consciously seek out diverse perspectives, especially those that challenge your existing views. Use specific search terms rather than just browsing suggested content. Read complete articles rather than just the headlines. Look for primary sources when possible. So, for example, if you get something from, say, Forbes and someone shares it on the internet, go look at the Forbes article and then go see if you can find an additional article somewhere else from another source to confirm the information. Consider using tools that reduce algorithmic curation of your feeds or that help identify potential misinformation. More importantly, develop the habit of asking critical questions. Who created this content? What's their motivation? What evidence supports their claims? What might they be leaving out? What would a critic say in response? This approach doesn't mean becoming cynical about all information. It's rather about developing a more nuanced ability to assess credibility and perspective. And finally, strengthen your community's collective resilience against propaganda. Information literacy shouldn't be an individual burden. It's a social skill we develop together. Have conversations about media consumption habits with friends and family. Share techniques for evaluating sources. Create social norms that value accuracy and thoughtful consideration over quick reactions and viral sharing. Support institutions and platforms that prioritize information integrity over engagement metrics. And remember that the most effective counter to propaganda isn't counter-propaganda. It's building communities where people feel secure enough to consider new information without identity threat, where curiosity outweighs defensive reactions, and where we recognize our shared vulnerability to manipulation regardless of our political or personal position. The landscape of persuasion continues to evolve at an accelerating pace, driven by technological advances and deeper understanding of human psychology. So, what might the future hold, and how can we prepare for it? Artificial intelligence represents perhaps the most significant frontier. AI systems can already generate text, images, audio, and video that's difficult to distinguish from human-created content in many cases. This technology democratizes content creation, which is not necessarily a good thing, but also enables new forms of misinformation and manipulation. AI can also analyze vast data sets to identify psychological patterns and vulnerabilities invisible to human marketers. Imagine persuasion systems that adapt in real time to your emotional state, your attention level, and specific psychological triggers, personalizing manipulation at a scale and precision previously impossible. The combination of generated content and targeted delivery could create persuasion ecosystems where every element is optimized to influence specific individuals based on their unique psychological profiles. Our physical and digital worlds are increasingly merging through technologies like augmented reality, virtual reality, and the Internet of Things. As our environments become more interactive and connected, the opportunities for embedded influence multiply. Smart homes, wearable devices, and connected vehicles collect intimate data while creating new touchpoints for persuasion. Augmented reality could overlay personalized marketing onto our physical world. Imagine walking down a street and seeing different storefronts highlighted based on your preferences or product recommendations appearing as you look at items in your home. These technologies promise convenience and customization, but also extend the reach of influence systems into previously private spaces and moments. As these technologies advance, so too must our regulatory frameworks and ethical standards. current approaches to consumer protection, privacy, and political advertising were designed for earlier media environments and struggle to address the complexities of algorithmic persuasion, synthetic content, and pervasive data collection. Some promising directions include mandatory transparency about automated systems, stronger data privacy protections, better labeling of synthetic content, and public education about digital literacy. But perhaps most important is shifting our perspective from seeing these as merely technical issues to recognizing them as fundamental questions about human autonomy, democratic functioning, and what kind of society we want to create. The future of persuasion isn't predetermined. It depends on the choices we're making right now about how these technologies should be deployed, developed, and governed. We've covered a lot of ground today, exploring the psychology behind marketing and propaganda, their impact on individuals and society, and strategies for maintaining our autonomy in a world designed to influence us. If there's one thing I hope you take away from this conversation, it's that awareness is power. Understanding how persuasion works doesn't make you immune to it. We all have psychological vulnerabilities, but it does give you the opportunity to make more conscious choices about what influences you accept. This isn't about becoming paranoid or rejecting all marketing as manipulation. Marketing at its best connects people with products and services they genuinely need and that improve their lives. Persuasive communication can mobilize people for positive social change and help us solve collective problems. So the issue isn't influence itself, it's influence that's hidden, manipulative, or that undermines our shared reality for private gain. So, what can you do with this knowledge? Start by examining your own media diet and consumption habits. Notice which emotions are being triggered and why. Practice slowing down before sharing content that provokes strong reaction. Support journalism and platforms that prioritize accuracy over engagement. Have conversations with friends and family about how technology is shaping your attention and your beliefs. And perhaps most importantly, remember that the ultimate antidote to division and manipulation is genuine human connection based on empathy and shared humanity, rather than manufactured outrage or identity performance. I'd love to hear your thoughts and experiences with these issues. Have you noticed marketing techniques affecting your own behaviors and beliefs? What strategies have you developed to maintain your autonomy? Share your insights on our social channels or leave a comment in our Patreon or wherever you listen to our show. And if you found this episode valuable, subscribe and share it with others who might benefit from this conversation. Thank you for joining me today on PsyberSpace. Next week, we'll be exploring the psychology of decision-making under uncertainty. Until then, remember, understanding the forces that shape our thinking is the first step towards true freedom of thought. I'm your host, Leslie Poston, signing off. Stay curious.